This is section 2.4. This is part 1. An introduction to applications of linear equations. Applications, that's word problems. As a math professor, it's kind of a double-edged sword. I get asked all the time, when is this ever used in real life? So we show you word problems and the student's like, well, I hate those. We just can't win. I think the biggest anxiety that comes from word problems is that we read the problem and we feel like we should know how to do it immediately. And that's just not generally the case. That's not how problem solving works in real life at all. So what we're going to do now is we are going to talk through initially the process for setting up a word problem, the general process for setting them up. And then as we work some problems, as we go through the course, we'll be talking about ways to identify a particular type of word problem. And then if you can get the type right, then you will often be able to make a good decision about what kind of tools you have to get the problem worked. And then the setup is easier and then you can work the problem. But in general, let's just start talking about the steps. The first step is to read the problem. Now that sounds obvious, but again, you do not need to know how to work the problem at this point. Concentrate instead on understanding what you're being asked to do. Now what I usually do in the classroom is I ask my students if they know where, let's go with Turkey, Texas, the city Turkey, Texas. And then I ask my students to drive there. That is their job. Now, chances are you don't know where Turkey, Texas is. But if you do, think of some other city you don't know where it is, like Telephone, Texas, or Wink, Texas, or Barkley, Texas, or Kittiquay, Texas. Those are all cities I go to if my students happen to know the one I pick first. Anyway, so your job is to drive to Turkey, Texas, and you're supposed to go get in your car and do it right now. Now, probably you don't know where it is, so you can't just get in your car and drive. So you understand the type of problem. I've got to drive somewhere, right? So you're driving somewhere. You ask yourself, what tools do you have? Well, you could use GPS, okay? Assuming that you have a signal and you know how to spell the city name. If I had asked you to go to Kittiquay instead of Turkey, you might not realize it starts with a Q, so you have a problem. Okay, so your first go-to is probably GPS, but then if your GPS isn't working for some reason, you have other options. You know that you could, in theory, find a paper map. You could stop at a gas station and ask somebody. You have a lot of options, but you understand the type of job you're being asked to do. You know what tools you have to get it started. That's the type of thing we're going to go through here. Read the problem, understand what you're being asked to do, and then we will be able to figure out kind of where to go from there. Don't stress about it if you don't know how to work it from the beginning. Okay. Your second step is going to be to assign a variable. There will be at least one thing that we do not know, and we will set our variable up on that. You need to make sure you tell me what your variable is standing for. And not just tell me, but you need to tell yourself, because on a lot of these problems, you're going to have options. And the way the problem works depends on what option you made, what option you took. So it needs to be very clear. A labeled picture works for this. Okay. Then we're going to write an equation, and this is the most difficult step. We're going to discuss a lot of strategies for this, so don't worry about this just yet. Then the most obvious part is to, well, probably the second most obvious step, but you have to solve the equation that you wrote here. This is usually the easiest step. This is usually the most difficult step. Now, we have a tendency as humans to solve the equation and think we're done. And we are done with most of it, but we may have to make sure that we actually answer the question asked. Sometimes the answer here is the answer here. Sometimes the answer here is part of the answer here. Sometimes what you get here is only enough to get to quickly figure out the 2 or 3 answers here. So it's usually an easy step. It's hard to remember to get it done. Okay, now the last step is not something I expect you to ever have to write down, but I do expect you to think about it every single time. After you have worked a word problem, I want you to ask yourself if your answer is reasonable at all. Okay, these are real world problems. Your answer needs to make sense in the real world. So for example, if the question asks how many buses were on a trip, you can't tell me it's 2.34 because you can't send 0.34 buses on a trip. Okay, so ideally you go back and you try to find your mistake. If you were asked to find how many coins there are in a jar, you can't end up with -4. It just doesn't make sense. You can't have half a coin in a jar either. So you need to ask yourself if your answer makes sense in the real world. If not, see if you can find your mistake. Now, on this class right now, we're going to be doing online exams. So this doesn't really apply, but if you were in class and you're taking a paper test, I would ask you to write your answer as not reasonable and then tell me why. And you wouldn't lose as many points. But since we're doing everything online right now, you need to try to just keep this in mind. And since I'll be using this video in the future, if you are in an in-person class where you're taking paper tests, then this is going to apply. If you're listening to this and you're in a fully online class, it will not, because we'll be doing our tests online. Okay? Continuing in the next section.